Running out of fuel, Cuba is struggling to keep the lights on as the US ramps up economic pressure and military threats. Washington's now offering aid, but at a cost. Will the system set up by the Castros break down? This is Inside Story. Hello again, I'm James Bays. Cuba's economy has been battered by decades of US sanctions, but since 2021, an energy crisis and food shortages have pushed an estimated 20% of its population to leave. And now Havana has announced the country is nearly out of fuel. It comes after months of added pressure from Washington. The US cut off oil shipments from Venezuela and then imposed a near-total oil blockade. Paired with Cuba's aging energy grid, the result, sweeping blackouts, supply shortages and a deepening economic crisis. Washington's goal is to force the socialist government to open up the economy and implement political reforms. Donald Trump has even threatened Havana with military action. So what lies ahead for Cuba? Will it be forced to accept the US president's demands? We'll discuss all of this when we're joined by our panel of guests in a moment. But first, this report from Malahabe Motsepe.
US President Donald Trump has repeatedly threatened to attack Cuba, calling it a failed state.
They need help, as you know. And you talk about a declining country. They are really a nation or a country in decline.
Cubans have for years faced recurring fuel shortages and nationwide power cuts. That is in part due to decades of US sanctions and aging power generation facilities. But blackouts have recently become more severe, especially after Washington imposed a blockade on oil shipments earlier this year. And people are losing electricity for up to 18 hours a day.
We have absolutely no fuel, no diesel. We have absolutely no diesel whatsoever. And I'm repeating myself. The only thing we have is associated gas in our wells.
Cuba has imported most of its oil from Venezuela over the past 30 years. But that arrangement ended after the US military abducted and imprisoned former President Nicolas Maduro in January. Since then, the Trump administration has been overseeing Venezuela's oil production and exports. It's proposed a direct humanitarian assistance package of $100 million on the condition the socialist government makes what the State Department has called meaningful reforms to its economy and political system. Following the offer, the head of the CIA arrived in Havana to meet senior officials, including the Cuban Interior Ministry's chief of intelligence. US media reports say that rare visit is part of a plan to potentially charge Cuba's 94-year-old former president Raul Castro. The indictment would reportedly charge Castro for shooting down 2 airplanes in 1996, killing 4 people who were part of a Cuban exile group. Havana accused the group of violating Cuban airspace, but the International Civil Aviation Organization said the attacks happened in international waters. Castro, who is still regarded as a powerful political figure, was the defense minister at the time. The Trump administration is intensifying pressure on Havana to open its economy to foreign investment. And with its energy supplies dwindling, Cuba may not be able to hold out much longer. Malahabe Motsepe, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's discuss the current situation in Cuba with our panel of guests on today's Inside Story. And joining us from Havana, Ruaridh Nicoll, The Guardian's Cuba correspondent, former editor of The Observer magazine. In Washington, D.C., Adolfo Franco, a Republican strategist and former official at the Latin America and Caribbean Bureau of the U.S. Agency for International Development. And in London, Javier Farje. He is journalist and historian specialising in Latin American affairs. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. Let me start with you, Ruaridh, because I think it's worth finding out how things are where you are in the Cuban capital. You've heard what the energy minister said just a few days ago. Absolutely no fuel, no diesel, no reserves. Cuba's had problems for very many years economically, but how bad is it now?
Yes, it feels very much like a tipping point. I mean, the situation has been bad for a long time. There, as your reporter said, the economic situation has been parlous for about 5 years now. But we're now 4 months into the US oil blockade, and the past week has been really, really grim. Much of the country has been enduring blackouts of up till 22, 23 hours for a while now. That's really hitting in Havana. You saw on Wednesday night people out on the street banging their pans, making sort of a lot of noise, shouting, "Turn the power on." You saw them burning piles of trash that have not been collected. This is expressing real sort of suffering now, because people, you've got to understand, it's now getting very hot in the Caribbean. We're now into May. The temperatures are rising. People are finding it very difficult to sleep, because if they don't have power, they don't have fans, their children aren't sleeping, they're not sleeping. Worse still, because of the economic crisis, about 40% of the population really have no access to money, and food is becoming expensive. They bring home the food, they put it in their fridges, and then there's no power, the food goes off. So people are really struggling, especially people with small children. I live in an extremely privileged position compared to the majority of Cubans. I live right next to the US Embassy, which means they tend to keep the power on with me a little more, but I haven't had power for probably 16 hours at this stage, probably why I'm a bit red-faced. But for the majority of Cubans, yeah, it's a parlous situation. You just quickly, just to add to that, we have, over the last week, you're having this enormous amount of stress put on Cuban people by the news. The US is releasing sort of quite sort of threatening language constantly, day after day. And so people don't know when it's going to end. People have no idea what the end game is, where they might land. And that is putting people under an enormous amount of mental pressure. And we're seeing huge spikes in people taking psychotropic drugs and things like that. So people are really suffering.
People suffering, Adolfo, because of what your government is doing, what the Trump administration is doing. And of course, this pressure that comes now is on top of sanctions that are the longest running sanctions, perhaps with the exception of North Korea, anywhere in the world. And of course, Cuba is the US's neighbour, so they bite much harder than anything to do with North Korea, don't they?
Well, that's a loaded question if I've ever heard one from an anchor. But let me respond.
Why is it a loaded question? It's clearly historically accurate.
It's not the United States sanctions, sir. It's the failed policy of a communist system that has never worked, and it's only worked when it's received subsidies. And the rest of the world has economic ties to Cuba to the extent they want to have them, and they don't because it's a debtor country. So frankly, you don't know what you're talking about. I ran the Cuba program for the United States government. I'm a Cuban American. I was born in Cuba. I have family in Cuba, and I'm in contact with that family in Cuba. So I think I have an insight that, frankly, you do not. The other guest from Havana correctly depicted the situation in Cuba. And I'm glad he said, because of the background he's in, that he's in a privileged setting, which I understand because he's a foreigner and a guest. Where he's living, only elites in Cuba live like that. The situation in Cuba has been desperate and has been desperate for many years because of a failed economic system. The president is right when he calls it a failed state, and it has been a failed state for decades. The difference has been that when the Soviet Union was around, it was subsidized and it was kept afloat. Anything can be kept afloat if you inject enough money. And of course, in the 1990s, as you have a historian coming, we had a similar crisis, referred to in Cuba sometimes as the special period. And that's when Cuba almost failed and you had some types of demonstrations. Now it's far more acute. Situation has decayed. The problem is, if you look at debtor countries in the world, Cuba's at the bottom of the list. It rivals North Korea. There is no investment in Cuba. You can't invest in a society that doesn't allow investment and only the military controls it. We're not going to provide assistance to a government that is totalitarian, represses its people, has the largest percentage diaspora of any country. That means people leaving and fleeing the country in modern history. And that tells you what a failed system it is. Most of those people you see on the street would give anything to reach the United States for political and economic relief, both. So that is the reality of Cuba. It's not the doing of the United States. It's the doing of a totalitarian, repressive regime that is only in power because it uses brutal force to keep its population in check. Those are the facts. The economic facts were nicely stated by your guest in Havana. The other facts are not that this would be a great, prosperous country if the United States did not have what I think has been largely a very weak embargo anyway on Cuba.
Okay.
That is what the reality.
Let me bring in Javier on that. Adolfo challenging me there, and clearly there has been mismanagement by the Cuban government. But what has changed in recent months is it not, Javier, the US administration piling on the pressure, the lifeline that was Venezuela, and the energy supplies from Venezuela cut because of the US military action, and perhaps a little bit the Iran war, again, the actions of the Trump administration.
Well, yes, I mean, I partly agree with Adolfo, not entirely. To dismiss the sanctions or the embargo as not playing a relevant role in the economy in Cuba is not to take into account the history of the relation between the United States and the Cuban Revolution. However, it is true the big mismanagement of the economy. There's no question about that. Back in 2020, Fidel Castro criticized the socialist model, the socialist economic model, saying it hasn't worked. When he was asked, do you think we could export your model? And he said, well, it hasn't worked for us. How is it going to work for anybody else? There was a level of criticism by Fidel Castro himself of the socialist economic model. So, and then there was a bit of opening to the private sector, not a big one, bit of opening to the private sector in order to make them more competitive and to reduce the huge size of the Cuban state, which is big because it is communist bureaucracy. I was in Cuba when that happened. You could see private businesses thriving in many ways, but it never pushed for more openness in terms of the private sector. Now, it seems to me that, I mean, you cannot dismiss the embargo as if it doesn't play any role. It has stopped Cuba from getting hard currency to be able to develop their own economy, and that's really a big problem for them. But it has. But also, I am prepared to admit that mismanagement of the economy, this concept of centralized economy based on the socialist principle of centralized economy, has not worked. As I said to you, Fidel Castro himself criticized that in 2010. What seems to me is that the current strategy of the government is to put pressure on the government through the private sector. Allow me to just quote Marco Rubio when he allowed the export of 30,000 barrels of diesel back in March. He said, and I quote, entirely designed to put the private sector and individual private Cubans, not affiliated with the government, not affiliated to the military, in a privileged position. I don't think he's in favor of bombing Cuba or invading Cuba, because that would create a flood of refugees going to the United States, something that Trump does not want, because he wants to get rid of refugees and immigrants rather than have more there in the United States. So I have the feeling this is the case. Now, there is a law that allows the private sector to import diesel from the United States. The problem is that there's no money to do that. So I have the feeling, but also it's important to realize that having the head of the CIA, John Ratcliffe, visiting Cuba, which could have sounded heresy not long ago, the visit of the head of the CIA in the revolutionary Cuba, not the CIA of the exploding cigars or whatever you want to believe on, or not that, but visiting and discussing issues related to the economy and security, means that in one place, on one part they're playing the carrot, that means, having talks, but also playing the stick. Marco Rubio, he's never expressed any sentiment in trying to invade in Cuba. I don't think he wants that. In fact, he started early negotiations with the grandson of Raúl Castro, Raúl Guillermo Rodríguez Castro, known as the Crab or Raulito, in order to try to find a way to find a solution for the situation. So I think
can I bring Ruaridh back into the situation, into the discussion, please? About the sorry, Adolfo, do you want to say something quickly? You got a point to raise?
Yeah, I want to say I thought that was, I don't entirely agree with the other guests, but very quickly, I just want to comment before we talk about Raul, and I want to shift to that. The questions on, I think it's a very soft word to say mismanagement. It's a system that does not work. So I disagree with the use of that term. But let me say about the sanctions. When it's sanctions, we sell you're right. The other guest is right. I wanted to say this. We've sold all kinds of agricultural products to Cuba if it has cash, for the last 25 years, number one. Secondly, there's enormous remittances that come from Cuban Americans that are sent to the Cuban economy. And that's what's kept it afloat for so many years. So this idea that it's sanctioned, these embargoes, and this is completely sealed is just not true. And you're right about Secretary Rubio. We did it in our program. We managed the program. If we could send money and get it to actual citizens, we did. I managed those programs in the tens of millions of dollars. So this idea that Cuba is not receiving anything from the United States is just not true. It is controlled, and it's on a cash basis only. I just wanted to get that clarification.
Yeah, no, thank you, Adolfo. If I could bring in Ruaridh, we've had prediction of the end of the Castro system for very many years indeed. And I'll agree with Adolfo. I don't claim to be a Cuba expert, but I was there at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union 34 years ago, and people said that the system was going to collapse. And of course, although there have been reforms and changes since, the country Fidel Castro built still stands. Yet you have protests. We'll come to what the US is doing in a moment, but is there any possibility, you think, that without the US getting involved right now, that things may come to a head without US intervention of any sort, Ruaridh?
Oh, they've got it down. They are an authoritarian state. There's no question about that. They are very good and they're very practiced at keeping people in line here and exiling them if they don't do the right thing. So there was a book that was published at the beginning of the special period called The End of the Revolution. In 2003, there was a book saying End of the Castros. I actually wrote a piece which they put the headline End of the Revolution, and I got a friend said, you should be aware this is not the first time that's been said, and this can run for a long time. Can I just quickly say, Adolfo, fine, I totally grant that I'm privileged, but I am married to a Cuban, I have a Cuban child, I have a Cuban family, so I am pretty much in with the bricks here. I've been here 9 years. Just on the I think we should move beyond how. I think we're all agreed that this is not a government that works. I flew down to Santiago, the other city, which is 550 miles away. We're at the beginning of the oil blockade, and I hitchhiked back because I actually wanted to see what was happening on the street. I stood beside the road, I held up pesos, I got in the cars, I traveled in every possible form of transport, and I talked to people. And I was quite surprised because I believed that the people on the island, the Cuban people on the island, really didn't care who was to blame anymore. They just wanted things to change. I was very struck to find, I spoke maybe to 30 people in depth, and 28 of them, only 2 people blamed the Americans for the current situation. Nearly all of them thought Donald Trump is slightly out of control. They used much harder language than that. They didn't appreciate him. Nearly all of them believe in sovereignty. They don't want an American takeover of Cuba. They've been through that before. Well, they haven't, but Cuba's been through that before. It led to the revolution in many ways. But they did all. One of them stood beside the road and said, do you see these new Dodge Rams? Because Adolfo is right. You can import cars from the US to this day. You just can't fill them with gas. But they said, looked at these new Dodge Rams and these new beautiful Toyotas that drive past, and they say, those are the people who are running our country. Those are the people of the new elite, and they're not stopping to pick us up. And I thought that was a very telling stage. So I think you've got 3 guests who all agree that the government here is moribund and is clinging on to power for reasons that we can discuss. What we may not agree on is what the US is doing. The US is being brutal at the moment. It is very smart, very clever. The oil blockade is hurting people. It's meanwhile coming up with stuff. And I speak as someone who loves the US. I've loved the US for a long time. Ever since I was a child, I was the US correspondent of my newspaper. I've got a great faith in the US. But it is releasing news that I know isn't true. And it's doing it to increase pressure. There was a story yesterday about about Cuba having 600 drones that could attack the US. Now, maybe, but I'd be super surprised. Look, the US says that Cuba is a state sponsor of terror. This is a country that can't even feed its people.
Okay,
they have been terrified.
Let me put those points. Please, Ruaridh, let me put those points to Adolfo. Adolfo, your response is the US engaging in propaganda right now?
Well, every country engages in propaganda and certainly psychological warfare, and that's part of the coming indictment on Raul Castro to hopefully shake it up with the rest of the gang, the bandit gang that runs Havana, to see if they can break loose and have internal dissension in Cuba. Look, I largely agree with many of the things the guest said from Cuba, and maybe having a Cuban.
That's awful to get people onto the street. To try and force people onto the street is awful. Can we just agree that's terrible to do?
Well, I disagree with you, but this regime, according to Mossad, and I was in the U.S. government at the time, which is the Israeli intelligence agency, Cuban intelligence is the best in the world. So this idea of this poor country that doesn't do it, invests everything it has in its repression. It isn't, we'll talk about moving forward. It isn't authoritarian, my friend. It's totalitarian. There's a difference. And that secret police and its enforcement, its brutality, you should be focused on the brutality of the regime against its own people.
Okay, Adolfo, I want to move you on only because we're limited in time, and I want you to explain to us, Adolfo, what the Trump administration is actually trying to do. Can you tell us what, in your view, what the objective is? Is it to remove completely the system that has been in power since the revolution, or is it, as the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio has said, Cuba needs to change? And it doesn't have to change all at once. Is it a sort of Venezuela model to change somebody at the top but keep the system in place? What is your view of the current policy?
Okay, let me move forward on that question. First, I agree with the other guests that had said Secretary Rubio, who I know very well and personally, is not looking to invade Cuba. What we want is the latter. We want some transition in Cuba. Obviously, the goal of every American presidency has been regime change of some sort, and we still desire that, as we desired it in Iran. But we want it to come from within. In this case, there is no invasion plan. This idea of the president, I know, has said that sometimes. The president also said we're going to invade Greenland, and Canada is going to be a state. So the president says things, and Venezuela a state, that says things to shake things up in Cuba. The goal of the administration is to bring about regime change with additional pressure. And that pressure, the guest from Havana said, I'm sorry to say, the Cuban American community, and they're very recent arrivals and have family there as myself, strongly approve of the United States, as he refers to, brutal action against the Cuban people. And the Cuban people ultimately know that's the only way to bring about change. So that is the game plan, to bring about internal change with enough pressure within, not an American invasion.
Javier, do you think that all of the administration is of the same view? And having heard the way Adolfo has just explained it, is the US plan going to work?
I doubt that regime change is a priority for the United States. Look what happened in Venezuela. I think Trump and Marco Rubio played a good cop, bad cop, good cop. Marco Rubio is more the tendency is to negotiate, to discuss the issue. It happened in Venezuela with Delcy Rodriguez, the president of Venezuela, after Maduro was kidnapped, arrested, or whatever you want to call it. And now the regime is still there, intact, hasn't moved. There's been a lot of pressure to release political prisoners, to open up a bit more the economy for the oil. Many companies don't want to invest in the oil in Venezuela anyway. So I think if we follow the model followed in Venezuela, which I believe is the philosopher Marco Rubio, I think he tries to avoid confrontation. And it's true that he wants a slow process of change, but he doesn't want to force it, because that would create probably, if there is an attack on Cuba and there was a flood of refugees from Cuba to the United States, that's something that Donald Trump does not want. I'm not sure about using Mossad as a reliable source of information in terms of whatever they do, so I'm not going to get into that. But what I believe is that Marco Rubio he started negotiating with the grandson of Raul Castro long before they started negotiating with the government of Diaz-Canel, the president of Cuba. It's very interesting that. But also, and he said at the time, we want change, political and economic change. I have the feeling that Marco Rubio's idea is to try to create change within Cuba via the economy, to strengthen the private sector in Cuba, which is still small, but it's becoming influential because they are the only people who can actually import oil and fuel and things like that, because the embargo only applies to state-owned companies, which is when in the 1960s. So I have the feeling that is the strategy of Marco Rubio. He wants to avoid a direct confrontation between the government of the United States and Cuba. The president of John Radcliffe, the head of the CIA in Cuba, which was heresy until some time ago, it's something which I think is extremely interesting in terms of the way they want to deal with Cuba. So
okay, let me bring in Ruaridh again, if I can. Is there a real danger with this US policy that the anti-immigration president, Donald Trump, might, if he does things wrong, trigger a situation where many, many more people leave Cuba? Some estimates say nearly a quarter of the population has left in the last 5 years. Ruaridh?
Well, certainly we've lost nearly 2 million people from Cuba in the last 5 years. You might notice behind me the lights have just come back on. So they went off at 11 last night. They've just come back on. So, as I say, I'm in a privileged position. Yes, I suppose this is one of the big things. I've not really as a journalist, I'm not really concentrating on the possibility of lots of people leaving. I don't see that as the end game here. I mean, there is the possibility that a vacuum's created and then a true horror show results with civil war or whatever, but I don't think that's what we're looking at. I think they're being very smart in how they're doing it. I think that the CIA director arriving is suggesting that the negotiations are continuing. My fear, I suppose, is that, let's be frank, Donald Trump wants a win. He wants a win before the midterms, and he wants the prize of Cuba. As Adolfo said, the presidents have wanted that forever, and he said it, he wants to be the man that does it. Rubio is slightly different because he is Cuban American like Adolfo, and he feels it's in his blood that he wants to see Cuba, in his terms, free.
Ruaridh, thank you very much, and thank you to our guests today, Ruaridh Nicoll, Adolfo Franco and Javier Farje. If you missed any of our discussion, remember you can see the programme again anytime at our website, aljazeera.com. What should we discuss next time? We want to hear from you. Go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or find us on X. There our username is @AJ Inside Story. That's it from me, James Bays, and the team here for now. But don't go anywhere, because Al Jazeera's coverage continues in a moment. Stand by for an update.